Hello and welcome to the Yale SOM Exchange webinar, Meet the Legal Cannabis Industry. Yale SOM Exchange is the Yale School of Management series of online conversation. This series provides alumni and the entire Yale SOM community with opportunities to keep learning about faculty research, current events, and career strategies. I'm Timmy Ashiru, a second-year full-time MBA at the Yale School of Management, and today I'll be moderating the panel. Before enrolling at SOM, I was Chief Operating Officer at Cafe Neo, which is a coffee startup in Nigeria. Prior to this position, I worked in marketing and communication roles across CPG and energy companies in Nigeria. Today, I'm also joined by two amazing SOM alumni who are leaders in the cannabis space and were also featured speakers at the Yale SOM Business of Legal Cannabis conference that we hosted in February. Mauricio Agudelo, SOM class of 2014, is the Chief Financial Officer for Fortma Life Sciences, the leading cannabis cultivator in South America operating in Uruguay. Tahira Ramatullah, also SOM class of 2014, is an investor and advisor to numerous cannabis businesses and entrepreneurs with expertise in brand development, investment strategy, and operational growth. So hi you two. You both were in the same MBA class of 2014 and both ended up working in the cannabis industry after your time at SOM. So I would love if you would be able to share a bit about your journey into the industry. Would you like to start, Tahira?
Sure. So I came into the space straight out of business school in 2014, and really at that time had no idea that cannabis was even an industry you could get into. But I started looking at cannabis because my grandfather was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer during my second year of business school, kind of towards the beginning of the year. And really, it was just in a search for alternative treatments as he was going through chemotherapy. My mother in particular kept coming across cannabis, asked me about it, and I started doing a lot of research on it. And so really was surprised and kind of shocked by how much was going on in the space, very under the radar. And the formal economy hadn't really developed yet. And then very fortuitously was able to join a company called Profitability Holdings, also started by several Yale alumni. And that's the rest is history, I guess. So I've been in the space now since 2014.
Great. And Mauricio, you trained as a lawyer. How did your journey evolve to get you where you are today?
Yeah, well, thank you again, Temi, for putting this all together and for the Yale School of Management for allowing us to come back and speak not only to current students, alumni, and interested parties, but really to share the experiences that Tahira and I have had over the last 6 years for her and roughly four and a half years for me. I trained as a lawyer, as you noted previously. I was a white-collar criminal defense attorney in New York City for just shy of a decade before going to business school and looking to transition into banking and private equity, more or less following the traditional path that career changers use business school to kind of act as that pivot. And I didn't go into cannabis. I certainly didn't believe that it was a sufficiently robust industry in 2012 or 2013 when we were looking for internship opportunities. But that was really because, it hadn't entered into the publications, into the public domain that I was familiar with. It's not at all to say that it wasn't a legitimate and big and growing industry. So I followed a more traditional career path, went to Credit Suisse and worked in the leverage finance department. And then through a series of other fortuitous introductions into the private equity world, I really started to weigh the options of being part of a nascent and growing industry, understanding that it felt like it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to not just participate in this industry that was ushering in this massive change from the black market to a seemingly gray market and then to a regulated market, but really being able to shape it, to participate in its development through the kinds of business transactions, financings, or consultation and leadership that you could provide. So as a career changer, I've been able to look at the industry from multiple perspectives, but, I'm still surprised by it every day. There's no question that we've had ups and downs over the last year. The capital markets have been a roller coaster ride, but I think that this brush fire that we're experiencing now, whether it's related to the general economy or related to the dips and vicissitudes in the capital markets, I think the companies that survive it will come out much stronger than those that went into it. And so we're really excited at Fatmer.
Oh, great, thank you. I really love how both of you had very traditional careers before SOM, and Mauricio, even after SOM, you still had a bit of a traditional path, and you sort of used that to create a foundation to prepare you for navigating this new or blossoming industry, or moving from a gray area to a legal area. I'm going to move into questions around the industry and move away a bit away from your core experience. And just to remind the audience that if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A, and it can be posed to either Tahira or to Mauricio, or both of them. But my first question is for Tahira, and a lot of the work you've done has focused on the US market, and a lot of the people you work with, cannabis entrepreneurs, business owners, and currently, the drug is legal in about 33 states in terms of medicinal use, and about 10 or 11 allow adults to use for recreational purposes. There appears to be a changing attitude towards cannabis, yet the policy, at least at the federal level, is lagging. Could you provide an overview of where we are now and what hurdles are being faced by companies, especially in relation to reform?
Sure. So, obviously at the federal level, as you said, it's still federally illegal to be a cannabis business, to be in the industry. But what has been enacted is that it's up to states to decide whether they want to legalize it medically, adult use, or a combination of the two. And so we've seen that started in 2014 with Washington and Colorado, and has really grown dramatically over the last couple of years with how many more states are taking on policy. The complication, because it's a federally illegal product, still creates so many complications when it comes to payments, because a lot of banks are not able to bank companies, or aren't comfortable that they aren't somehow going to be affiliated at the federal level with money laundering or other issues along those lines. So a lot of companies, although it's shifted quite dramatically, there are a lot of more tools that have come out that have allowed for companies to get bank accounts, but it is still more of a cash heavy business than any of us would like it to be, which creates a lot of issues, not just from the exchange of cash, but it's a security issue. Quite frankly, banks aren't equipped to handle volumes of cash on that kind of a basis. So that's an infrastructure issue to start with. The other side of it is, because it's a state-by-state policy, like other industries that have state-by-state regulation, it creates this fragmentation, because you can't as easily, one, you can't transport product across state lines. So when you think of just supply chain and economies of scale being able to develop for certain companies that operate in multiple states, it's very difficult to create those economies of scale, because you have to produce and ship within your state, confined state that you're operating in. Beyond that, too, there are issues when it comes to, ownership structures. Every state has different policies around that. States have different policies around who can qualify for medical cannabis. All states that have allowed an adult use program, it's similar to alcohol, where it's over the age of 21. But the licensing structures within each state are also complex, and the different approvals that you have to get and the different layers that you have to go through in order to get a license to either cultivate or have a retail storefront. Some states require that you have vertical integration, meaning you grow and you distribute all the way to the end. And other states require you to only have one type of license. So you can only grow, only be a brand, only deliver. So, you put all of those things together, and you can only imagine the complex web that has developed within the industry. But regulation continues to evolve. Obviously, we're in a time right now where we have very specific focus around the pandemic that is going on, and also what's happening broadly in the economy. So some policy has kind of taken a step back or just kind of put on the back burner. But what has been interesting to see in a lot of states is that as we're deciding what is considered an essential business, your grocery stores, your banks, things that you need on a daily basis, cannabis in a lot of locations has been considered an essential business. So I think that bodes well for the industry in thinking the direction of where the industry will go and how it's being viewed by the broader population.
Yeah, definitely. Just to follow up to that, because you sort of brought it up, and it's been considered an essential good, especially in light of the pandemic we're in. But prior to this pandemic, we did have an issue where there was a vaping crisis, and I wonder if is that being subjugated now, or is that something that we still need to look at regulation and sort of have a discussion or some policy around that.
Yeah, so what's interesting about the vape issues that developed is that predominantly the issues that came out into the market and the things that were seen as harming people were illegal products being produced. So this also bodes well for why legalization is absolutely needed. Because when you have those types of products being produced and you don't have regulation over the types of ingredients that can go in, certification around the impact of those ingredients, testing, etc., those types of products will develop. And what we've found by and large with the cases, particularly the ones that led to deaths, was that it was because there was a substance in there, vitamin E acetate, which should not be heated. And most of the products, actually, I think almost all products that were spot tested in different locations, particularly in California, that came through the legal licensed industry, did not contain that ingredient and were not shown to be impacting consumers negatively. I think we have a lot to learn about vaping in general. I think it's very early in the lifeline of e-cigarettes, cannabis vaping, and whatever other future products are going to come out of that. So I'm by no means saying it's a flawless, absolutely safe way to consume. But the ingredients that go into it and coming through a regulated market is really, really important. And I think that we'll see more regulation around how to really properly regulate those products and ensure that ingredients and anything that goes, any additive that goes in is safe for consumption.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that I'd like to add to it, because I think that we all share the desire for additional regulation as having been a part of multiple companies that view themselves as compliance-driven enterprises. Compliance and regulation is actually a great thing for companies that establish standard operating procedures, that follow the rules. They become economic moats that you can use in order to defend your position, to secure a brand identity, or to operate in general in a regulated market that recognizes the infrastructure that you've laid out. One of the dimensions that I think is really important to regulation and legislation, on top of just having a framework, is homogenization of those frameworks. So it's one thing to have a patchwork of regulations as we have now between the states and among the states that are often contradictory, complex, and the criteria, as Tahira laid out, for one jurisdiction could be anathema and completely antithetical to another jurisdiction. So it's not enough to have regulation. It's really ideal to have homogenization of that regulation, or of the local, not so much the local statutes, but statutes that cover large swaths, or international jurisdictions. We can have homogenization of everything from herbal pharmacopoeias, from definitions around what is CBD, what is psychoactive in its nature, what do we consider hemp from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, where we admit banking utility, banking facilities. I think that what we are asking for regulators to provide guidance to the industry, or rather legislators, is to give us a modality by which we can comply, right? I believe that all of the institutional investors who are eager to participate but might still be sitting on the sidelines are waiting for that single piece of federal legislation that either reschedules or deschedules cannabis, that provides some known and predictable banking infrastructure, or otherwise just states that, at least in the US, and this is a subject where Tahir is probably more knowledgeable than I, that provides uniformity across jurisdictions so that we can ultimately benefit from the supply chains that are going to be, intranational or international in the United States, and really have comprehensive networks where the regulatory, political, and execution risk of putting capital to work is reduced, because we know that we're compliant in Massachusetts, in Maine, or in Nevada, California, or Florida. That's really one of the dimensions that's lacking right now, is uniformity across definitions, like, what is it that do we have pharmacy distribution networks or dispensary distribution networks? We are a hodgepodge of different states that all have autonomy and all want to have some kind of identity with regard to how we treat cannabis. But what we really want is a strong, uniform federal backbone that is informed by international regulation, that follows the path that's been discussed by organizations like the UN or the INCB, that is sensitive to the international markets and responsible to the local markets, and then provides that credibility that small investors, retail investors, can get into either medical or adult use investments, and know that there isn't some kind of systemic risk that exists with those investments or with those opportunities that can't be later brought up in some kind of a ex post facto fashion, right? Give us clarity, and we're more than willing to go forward with that advice.
Yeah, so I guess you've brought in the international dimension into this conversation now, so we can switch a bit, because the global cannabis market is currently estimated to be worth about 150 billion US dollars. Barclays, in their European Consumer Staples Report in September 2018, suggested that this figure could increase to $272 billion by 2028. So it's a huge market. Currently, Canada and Uruguay are the only countries that have legalized cannabis for adult use, medicinal use. So there seems to be a movement away from strict prohibition. Although the lines are still very blurred as to what are the different forms of liberalization. You hear words such as legalization, decriminalization, not policed. So I guess I'm going to lean on your legal training to sort of ask, what do these terms mean, and what is the implication? You sort of started speaking to it as to the implication of operating, but if as a producer I wanted to operate or market my cannabis product to a global market, what do these terms mean, and how do I navigate that?
Yeah, we can certainly talk about that for just seemingly forever. One of the things that I like to bring up, okay, when we're talking about nomenclature, is one of the big misconceptions in the industry is that there is a legal definition or legal distinction between operation called touch the plant and those who are not touching the plant. As far as I know, and I could very well be wrong, there is no technical, actual legal distinction. It's much more of a term of art than it is a term of law. It's certainly not a term of science. And what we're asking for regulators and legislators to identify is that currently any involvement in this industry, presumably even this webcast, is in some way part of a scheme to distribute a Schedule I substance. The question is, how attenuated or how close are you to that felonious act? Because it is still illegal at the federal level. Now, I think that investors individually and institutionally have gained comfort in the attenuation and distance where their investment dollar interests lie from growing the plant, from actually keeping harvests and bringing them to fruition. But that would be, I think, one of the legal points of clarity that would provide a great deal of certitude, so that we can go out and say, all right, if there is this term of art, let's turn it into a term of law between hemp and between psychoactive cannabis. Now we have different schools where you either know that you're operating with a psychoactive material if it increases past a certain threshold, or if you're below it, you understand that you are exempted under a farm bill or something similar to that. Getting to your question, there's just a great deal. It's really kind of a spectrum understanding, and lacks the clarity that you would want for industries that are in some places as advanced as they are, for example, here in Amsterdam. So I'm calling in from the Netherlands, and it's, Amsterdam can be largely synonymous with cannabis and other cannabis-derived products. And the reason is because of its permissive culture around the coffee shops. One of the first things you learn is that if you're looking for coffee, you want to ask for just coffee, not a coffee shop, because you might end up in a place that sells pot down the street inadvertently. But the idea is that even here, those coffee shops operate by a permission that is not exactly expressly granted in federal statutes or local statutes, but has been accrued and has been acquired by the operators of those coffee shops for some time. So as we look to the municipal laws of kind of what's allowed, what's permitted, are you carrying past a certain amount where you're exempted for personal use, or does it start to look like it's a scheme to distribute an illegal substance? Man, there's a hodgepodge of laws and regulations. They are not reconciled or often even codified. So one of the first recommendations that I generally make to anyone that's thinking about getting into the industry or is in the industry is actually know the rules, know the laws inside and out, hire counsel, get legal opinions insofar as they're available, avail yourself of the counselorship that somebody like Tahira can provide, or the experience that other known operators in the space have, because the last thing you want to do is to set up to provide some kind of like articulated business opportunity that falls short because you either don't comply with some municipal ordinance, or you haven't fully understood the local kind of local mores, local practices on what's allowed. And so it's a big issue, and one that requires a great deal of compliance on the front end.
So thanks for that. I'm going to move over to some of the questions that come in from audience members. So the first question I'm going to ask, I guess both of you could answer, but it's focused on the public Canadian companies. And it's from David Vosberg. It's with the implosion of public Canadian companies, the impending fallout of some MSOs, what are you looking to invest in? What is a winning investment thesis during this time?
Sure. So I can jump in a little bit there. I've been following Canadian and U.S. operators for years. Was involved with a variety of them. Privateers was the creator of Tilray, which is one of the largest LPs in Canada. So what's interesting is that there was this rush to go public once it was allowed because Canada was starting to allow it. So all of these US operators also were IPOing on the CSE in Canada, much before I think a lot of these businesses were ready to or should have been encouraged to do so. But people got a little bit ahead of themselves. And what we're seeing, particularly over the last, call it 6 to 9 months, is that businesses are not meeting their own guidance. And we're getting into much more of a cycle where there are regular earnings. You have to, meet or beat your guidance in order to be traded favorably. And a lot of that has fallen out because everything was inflated. I mean, you had companies that were making 20 to 30 million in revenue and trading at a $15 billion market cap, which the math doesn't make sense. So there was a necessity, in my opinion, for the market to shake out a little bit. And I think in a lot of that, you'll see who has managed their cash appropriately and has managed their infrastructure appropriately, and who has not. So what I look at in businesses are, who are the management teams? Going back to the basics still, who are the management teams? What are the decisions they've made? How big is their team? How fluid have they made that team? Because one thing in cannabis is that rules change all the time. So if you are not equipped to be able to be agile and make those adjustments, you will falter in some sense. Other businesses that are able to corner markets that are unique, that have limited licenses, those are also really interesting. And I think also be able to expand their footprint, but not too aggressively. You've seen companies go and buy things like crazy using their public currency that don't have that much to do with their core business. So buying a lot candy businesses to make sure that you can put CBD and eventually THC into them. A lot of things that maybe are a little bit on the fray and that companies that are much older and much more sophisticated could do, but shouldn't do at this stage. So we're seeing a lot of divesting going on right now. So I think businesses that have been able to focus on a core thesis and a core infrastructure that they're going to be able to grow over the next couple of years. I think a lot of businesses are going to suffer and perhaps go out of business. And I think that that's the natural cycle of when you have these really hot markets and everybody throws money behind them without thinking, and then everybody loses their money. And then I think that there are going to be businesses that have also stayed private and have done so in a smart way that will actually come out ahead of some of the public companies and go public at a time when it's more appropriate for them and they're able to manage that balance sheet.
Yeah. So I do wonder, because it's sort of linking back to your earlier point about the corona epidemic. So a lot of the big cannabis stocks were down probably about 60% at the start of 2020. But with the recent declaration of cannabis as an essential good, you have stocks like Canopy and Tilray up by 35 and 43% respectively. One of the other questions that we have is that if federal law or the federal ban is lifted, what impact would that have on the smaller participants in the space, as it would appear that any benefits from a federal law being lifted would disproportionately be beneficial to big cannabis?
So I think, when it relates to the essential business side of it, I think that a lot of businesses are going to, they'll see some growth, but it's not going to be sustained growth, because the problem is going to be, to some extent, that they have to keep up with demand. And they're not really prepared to think of it in that context. You see crazy spikes in sales when there's a company called Headset, which tracks all of this transaction information. And they showed in Washington, Colorado, and California a spike between like March 13th and 15th, when we were really coming to a head with the information coming out around the pandemic. And people were just hoarding. They're stocking up, much like you can't find toilet paper anywhere on the shelves all across the country. It's similar to that. So I think there's probably going to be a rebalancing that has to happen, but I don't think that necessarily means that every public stock is going to flourish and be, wildly profitable anytime soon, because they're still working through a lot of infrastructure issues. So my advice would be to, if you're thinking of looking at some of those stocks, really understand their financial structure. And if this is a short-term bounce or more of something long-term that they can actually manage. For private companies, on your point about federal legality, it's a constant push and pull actually within the industry on how will federal legalization impact all of the smaller businesses that are within the space? And it is a real concern but it should not only be just a concern for the private smaller businesses in cannabis, but also the larger ones, because when you think about other organizations that would come into cannabis as soon as it's federally legal, we're talking about Fortune 500 companies, we're talking about big investment banks. It will change the landscape as we know it for everybody. And so a lot of people in the industry are actually trying to protect elements around that so they can continue to develop their infrastructure, have their consumer base in, and then we roll in with a variety of layers, like allowing banking, allowing some type of activity between states, but not this overnight legalization, because that really would disrupt a majority of businesses who are already operating.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to touch on one of those points. I think it's to go back to some of the nomenclature and understanding what exactly is happening. It is useful to remember that there hasn't been a uniform declaration that cannabis is an essential good. Certain cities and certain places have denoted that the dispensaries are important and won't have curfews and bans and things applied to them, but that's been also in patchwork operation, right? There hasn't been a uniform declaration of that, and so I think it's important to remember that this, if were it a homogeneous uniform industry, then such a declaration could be made by the federal government or by states, or because so far those enforcement policies have been determined by mayors, and I think in some capacities governors. But it would be lovely to see the federal government take a lead and to demonstrate that kind of support for the industry, number one. Going back to one of the points that Tahira was discussing about what makes a company attractive, what makes a sound investment thesis for companies that are bound by the geographic limitations of the U.S. Federal policies. That's going to be much more bespoke and much more specific. For international companies, I actually have personally developed a kind of a 4-step chart, a quick way to determine whether or not this company has a capacity for long-term sustainability. And the first step is whether or not you believe that there is an international supply chain, right? If you believe that in the short or midterm, we will get to a position where you can export freely or semi-freely between jurisdictions, such that low-cost jurisdictions will ultimately cultivate the products and engage in an international supply chain to higher retail jurisdictions that are customer focused, have distribution networks, are looking to develop brands, and often it's the competitive advantages of those large publicly traded companies, right? We're seeing that in their Ks and Qs, they are engaging actively in vertical disintegration. They are shedding non-core assets, and they're getting away from the cultivation activities because they've realized that it's not profitable. It's actually not a good idea to grow cannabis in Alberta. It's not wise to grow cannabis in the tundra, right? And so there are cost competitive realities where we believe that the international supply chain will at some point prevail. So that's the first step. The second step is to determine whether or not there is an actual proof of concept so that you can prove the thesis of an international supply chain. It's been a theory that's been around for quite some time, but I think that few companies have been able to engage it. It's the fundamental belief of that expanding total addressable market, the expanding universe, that denominator of how big can your company be, and is it a truly global company? In order to be a global company, you have to have an international supply chain where you can create something in one place and sell it somewhere else. The third point is having a pathway to profitability. Tahira brought this up a couple of minutes ago, that there are companies that make $100 million a year, or $200 or $300 million a year, but they spend $400 and $500 million a year. So it doesn't matter how much you make. What really matters is if at the end of the day, you have the capacity to operate from cash from operations and not to continuously operate or to need to operate from additional investment capital of cash from financing. I mean, it's just really going back to the fundamentals of whether or not you're operating a profitable company will determine your likelihood of success in the long term. And the fourth characteristic or feature that I think is really important for investors to consider is whether or not these companies have the runway to grow based on the current legislative or regulatory prohibitions that they have in the jurisdictions where they currently operate. So, for example, there, as Tahira noted before, there are limited licensing jurisdictions. Those are places where you want to be. It's attractive to have the total addressable market to be divided between fewer competitors rather than more competitors. If you're an international participant and your country has limited export quotas defined by the INCB or internal other structural limitations on the volumes you can grow, the types of product you can offer as between flower and oil, or where you are allowed to engage that international business, those are all limiting factors and constraining features that are really important to look at as you're evaluating an international thesis for a publicly traded company. So it's important to keep those four things in mind. Clearly, there are many more features that are important, but it's a neat rubric to follow in order to just determine on a threshold basis whether it sounds like a good mid and long-term play.
Right, thanks for that. Sorry, excuse me. That's really interesting to think about. I think at this point in time, a lot of people are trying to think of what is the path of profitability for these companies, and how do we invest properly? How do we make sure they're optimized for the best operations? And I mention this because you both went to, and I'm currently at the Yale School of Management, where the mission is to educate leaders for business and society. And this industry has had a history of mass incarceration of minority populations in the US. There's a war on drugs in South America. It's been a very dicey industry up until this point. And if we are going to see this shift, I personally, and I know a lot of people in the industry don't think of this shift to legalization as an if, but a when. So I do wonder, how do we as individuals, policymakers, business owners, or even as a community start to develop this legal cannabis industry that corrects or rights for the past injustice? And how do we create opportunities for communities to get equitable access to this industry if they want that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue that is continuing to gain momentum as more states legalize and more countries legalize as well. I mean, it's certainly a U.S. issue by and large, but it's impacted countries all over the world. With the U.S. in particular, I think that one of the larger issues remains that this industry has been around for decades, way before it was ever legalized in various capacities. So there are people who had been operating in that industry and also operating in medicinal environments who now can't really participate in the industry because it's too expensive, or they have some kind of a criminal record that in today's day and age would actually be legal. And going through the process of being able to expunge those records, I think, is one major issue that we need to simplify and do on a large scale national level. For low-level crimes, when you look at how many people are in prison or have been released from prison but have criminal records related to cannabis crimes that are now somewhat legal or legal in various jurisdictions. Like the numbers are astronomical. And it's very hard for those types of populations to go and expunge their records. It's not an easy process. I mean, Mauricio can probably talk to this as a lawyer. They don't make it easy. And so you have to have a lot of resources. There has to be time and money, and a lot of people don't have that. So we need to make it a uniform process that can be simplified and just done automatically, not something that people have to, spend so much time and energy doing. So I think that's one way to impact it. On the other side, as states continue to legalize, what we learned in a lot of early situations was the expectations around what businesses have to bring to the table, and even down to the application fee, were egregious. $200,000 application fees just to apply, only to get rejected. Leases and ownership of properties in advance of knowing whether or not you have a license. I mean, these are just not policies and requirements that allow for a more diversified base within the industry. And so that's why you're seeing the shift. I mean, the reality is cannabis looks like every other industry when you look at the population. It's largely white men. A lot of people who have transitioned from large public companies or Wall Street to come into cannabis because they have the resources to do it. So I think it's on the industry itself, on the business side, but also on the policy side, to ensure that we have hiring requirements, that we ensure diverse workforce, but then at the state and federal level, also make sure that all that tax revenue that we're generating from this industry goes back into communities that were harmed by the war on drugs, by either expunge programs, business assistance programs, training. There are a variety of ways, but the impact that it's been having on communities, and largely communities of color, date back decades and decades. So there's a lot of work to do there and a lot of damage to be undone, and we're just at the tip of it. But I think if we continue to enforce it, it's a business issue, it's a policy issue, it's a community issue. It's no one person or one vertical within the industry is going to solve it. We all have to work to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Tahira absolutely nailed it. The public policy implications of plenary rules around minority participation or female participation are very difficult to manage from an administrative point of view, right? I think that we can certainly make certain requirements around that, but I think that there is a genuine and grassroots interest that this new industry that's growing not follow the social justice predicates that came before, and follow the marginalization or incarceration of minorities, the exclusion of gender or other kind of normative participants in the industry. I don't by any means believe that it's solved or addressed or anything like that. But I think that it comes with the leadership that is in the C-suite now. I mean, you can see it, you can hear Tahira speak about it passionately. There's no question that as a Colombian man, that the social justice implications of legalizing a formerly black market activity like cannabis is something that has affected me and my community personally. On a very specific level. I remember when I told my parents that I was going to leave Wall Street in order to join a medical cannabis startup. And my mother, who's a devout, religious, older lady, she crossed herself a couple times, asked whether or not I had lost my marbles, and legitimately so, right? We're talking about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, on what this would look like, and whether or not the conversations that we needed to have as a family and we needed to have as a community were conversations around proscription rather than enthusiastic engagement, right? Be careful. Don't be the one Latino guy or black girl that gets caught up in this thing. It's like, no, I don't think those concerns are really there, but I think that they're less there because of us. right? Because we're shaping it right now. You know, Tahira's out there in the front lines. I'm out there in the front lines. You know, there's no question that capital will come from institutional resources, and that those institutional resources have general demographic and you know, other characteristics that aren't usually the people who have been historically disenfranchised, right? Like it's just kind of the truth about how capital is laid out. But I think, man, I'm actually really enthusiastic and really heartened by the idea that we now all have voices, right? They may not be equal voices yet, in so far as their influence, but they're going to be. There's no question that we're going to be able to change and at least offer solutions so that the administrative states that are required, the infrastructure that's required to enact legislation that would allow for an expedited expungement of you know, youthful indiscretion or youthful offender statutes, you know, things like that are you know, they will become part of the norm. As long as we continue to champion it, I think that we can get there. There's no question that we will be the generation that will change the view of minority participation in this industry, as we seek to claim positions of responsibility and authority within it.
Yeah, thanks for that. So switching gears a bit, because that's, I love when you both speak about social justice and the work you're doing. I think you both come from very diverse backgrounds into this and are very conscious of trying to make this industry as equitable as possible with the cards that we have. But I do want to change gears a bit and sort of harken back to the legal cannabis conference, which happened in February. So Michael Blue, who is also an SOM alum from the class of 2005 and managing partner of Profitability Holdings, encouraged people in the audience to innovate within the huge white space of cannabis. And I wonder, in your experience, and this also relates to a question about that has been asked by an audience member, is what opportunities do you see for entrepreneurs, especially in the nonprofit side of things? And anything you've seen in the white space that could be exciting that you think is not being, there's a general lack of focus by entrepreneurs?
I think that every business that you can think of at this point is starting to emerge within the industry. And what I think is so interesting and why I love the industry, I mean, a variety of reasons, but it is an intersection of a lot of different industries. It is pharmaceutical, it's healthcare, it's consumer packaged goods, it's social equity. I mean, you name it, cannabis kind of crosses with it. So I think it really, taking a step back and thinking about what's the skill set that a particular entrepreneur wants to bring to the table. I mean, technology is still sorely needed in a lot of different areas. We haven't really found perfect solutions, but we have a lot of solutions of how to develop. And what you have to think, particularly in the context, again, of the US, is that because it's been federally illegal, a lot of resources that you can use in every other industry, you cannot use in cannabis. So you can't use ADP for payroll services. So those businesses have developed. You could not use traditional marketing tools. You still can't use Google AdWords. So other platforms have developed. Their packaging, people were using kind of off-the-shelf things that you could get in bulk, but specific formats have been developed for cannabis that are for the end product and keep it fresher and safe and child resistant and all of that stuff. So think it's a really wide lens. What I think is an interesting area continues to be the education side of it, and I think nonprofits can particularly participate in the research, the education, the advocacy is also particularly important, and none of that stuff is going away. The education constantly shifts. We still don't have long clinical trials about the impacts of THC, about CBD. There are dozens of other cannabinoids, which are the molecules within cannabis, that are going to come out over time and have already started to emerge, and we don't know enough about them. Most of the information is anecdotal. So I think there's a very specific kind of opportunity within that. I also think that form factors for consumption are going to continue to evolve and should. Traditional method has been smoking. We obviously saw the shift into vaping. There are edibles, there are beverages. But at the end of the day, this is something that can be taken in a variety of formats, and it's continuing to change. I know groups that are coming out of medical devices and pharmaceutical that are looking at absorption methods into the body, and topical treatment. So if there's an interest in that area, I think that's a very interesting area that can be very beneficial for the industry and also highly lucrative.
Yeah, again, I think that Tahir is absolutely nailing the stuff, right on its head. Basic infrastructure services are lagging. There's the one thing that it's impossible for, I think, smaller entrepreneurs to start, that it's very capital intensive and requires deep technical knowledge, but is sorely needed, are payment systems, right? It's like the ability to transact freely. As Tahir mentioned, the basics of any other business are the things that are most challenging to function within in this industry. And so there just needs to be a secular shift in the way that the government views the industry, so that some of those, the frameworks, the infrastructures, the roadways for international or domestic companies, the way that we can operate is going to be determined by our ability just to do the mundane things freely, right? I think that one of the things that this coronavirus quarantine is illustrated is that you don't notice the simple and small things until they're taken from you in large ways, walking down the street, going to a park, that kind of stuff. And in a business context, you really don't you don't appreciate how useful it is just to have payroll services. Like running a company and not being able to have one click, one stop, wage and tax calculation services, not being able to understand what tax liabilities are by some clear method, but rather you have to engage in a semi alchemy of how much of this is dedicated to the cultivation versus the marketing versus the retail part if you are vertically integrated. And so to answer the question about nonprofits, I think that really the currency that would be most persuasive for nonprofit, I guess, thought experiments would be to engage in the kind of advocacy that leads to legislative and regulatory change. So think tanks, opinion pieces, whether they be editorials in national newspapers or the kind of invocations of local community groups to stand to table. I think that this is a useful opportunity to come full circle and to begin with that nebulous but important, evolving but critical denotation of the cannabis industry as an essential industry. That is proving out theses that have been held by cannabis entrepreneurs for quite some time. It's too early to conclude that cannabis is in fact a counter-cyclical industry, but there are some indicators that suggest it might be.
Yeah.
Right? There are some, the early data does suggest that the states, the people are viewing cannabis now as a staple, that they are interested in preserving its continuity, that supply chains can and will be interrupted, as Tahira noted earlier, but that this isn't just something that was fashionable and faded with the same kind of intensity with which it arrived. That this is something medicinal and homeopathic purposes, that this has a place in our communities and that we are responsible for making that available. And so if I were to imagine where the best and most persuasive parts of nonprofit leverage would come in, it would be to actually engage opinion leaders, legislators, and regulators to really give us the frameworks that we need to be able to provide the people with medicine that they desire.
Yeah, great. So we're coming round to the end we have about 5 minutes left. So I will ask one final question. This has been such a great conversation. I wish I could go on for longer, but we only have an hour. So my question is, people who are coming new into the space, or I think most of the advice that people normally ask is for people coming into this space and, if I want to be an entrepreneur. But I do wonder, if I was someone who has 15, 20 plus years of corporate and private business experience, who wants to begin a new career in the cannabis industry, what would be the one piece of advice you would give them at this point in time?
Mine would be to leverage the skill set that you have and understand where that fits in the broad industry. I mean, there's so many different ways you can get involved. We're actually seeing a massive shift, particularly in the last couple of months in the industry, in change in leadership in some of the largest organizations, because it was the time for the founders to move on and have a different skill set come in to be able to manage that phase of the business. And as we all know, I mean, leadership skill sets are often different times. So if you are more of a startup leader, think in that context. Don't go to a massive corporation and try to be a C-level executive, because that's just not really where your skill set lies. So I think in that context, I mean, we need people who have great experience in a lot of different areas. When you think of like consumer packaged goods and just understanding product development and supply chain, all of that applies. The biggest thing I would caution is, don't just try to get involved because you want to get involved. Go to what you've learned and where you can best apply it.
Yeah, there's no question. And sorry about that. I think my connection just got lost for a second there. This is like every other industry. This is nuts and bolts. This is blocking and tackling. This is all the tired metaphors that business professionals or grizzled guys can summon. Know what you're doing. Know what your value is. Bring it to a company. I think that that there's no shortage of both creative and technical opportunities in this industry. The creatives are certainly seen in brand opportunities and in identifying perhaps new markets that are coming online, as I tend to think in a global context, just because that's where my experience and my history has taken me. There are 150 countries that don't have medical cannabis legislation that is of any kind of meaningful use. And so the United States, even though it seems robust and it's teeming with people who are already there, and you're thinking, well, what am I going to do? What could I possibly do? I think that the characterization of this industry as a white space is absolutely true. There's nobody that has any meaningful market share in this place that is entirely defensible. In the US, in Canada, globally, less than a fifth or a tenth of the world's countries have passed real legislation, not talking about adult use, but have passed legislation that allows for the unmitigated use of medical cannabis. There are, 50 or 60 countries that have legislation that is permissive, that creates rights from reciprocal statutes, and that otherwise decriminalizes certain possession or certain activities. But we are very much in the infancy of this industry, And I don't know that Tahira and I will see the ultimate development of this space. I mean, the known cannabinoid universe is so vast, and we have spent a fraction of what we need to understand the two big cannabinoids that are often the topics of discussion.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, there's 200, 300, 400 other cannabinoids that have independent and complementary uses. So I think that whatever it is that you are doing, do it well, gain expertise, find some certification, whether if it's financial, become a CPA or an MBA or a CFA, go enthusiastically into those careers, and then transition into this space. Or if you already have that skill set, everybody is looking for you. I am constantly looking for skilled people to come join our company. So it's more about the question of whether or not you'd like to participate in shaping the industry than whether the industry needs you right now, because that is absolutely clear.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for joining this conversation today. So much knowledge has been passed. And thank you all for joining the Yale SOM Exchange webinar. Please keep an eye out for future webinars hosted by the school, and visit alumni.som.yale.edu to see upcoming events. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.